Hey everyone, it's James from Zygal Studios, and welcome back to Hardest Consoles to Develop On. Today on the cutting board, we've got the Atari Jaguar. I was really excited to get into this one because a lot of you had mentioned it in the comments and also made jokes about it. So I decided to add it to the stack, and here we are today. So in the previous consoles of the series, I've tried to focus on the harder aspects of software development based on the hardware that was provided in each console. And while the two consoles, the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation 3, both had their challenges, both of them had very long life cycles and produced some truly legendary games that are still talked about and played to this day. The 64 revolutionized at-cost 3D hardware. The PlayStation 3 revolutionized processing power broken down into more cost-effective unit. However, the Jaguar was a totally different story. Being introduced into North America in 1993 and discontinued in 1996, having sold less than 250,000 units, we can say it was a total failure. However, I'm not sure that it was totally due to the way the hardware was designed, as Atari was going through a lot of different changes. We can't really chalk up the entire fall of this system to its hardware, but it certainly played a part. In the early 90s, Atari felt the pressure to start back in the home console market and really needed a strong stake in order to get back on top. After talking with Flare Technology, a small computer hardware company in Cambridge, UK, Flare had convinced Atari that they'd be able to design a cutting-edge system that not only surpassed the other competition, which was the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, and the 3DO, but they'd also be able to make it at cost. And this gets back to the old adage, if something sounds too good to be true, generally it is. And this is no different with the Atari Jaguar. While I'm not specifically targeting the hardware designers of the system, as I think the hardware architecture is an absolute work of art and is ingenious, not only were there hardware bugs, but there was incomplete documentation. And this essentially led software developers who made games for this system to stray away from the instructions that Flare Technology had provided to software developers on how to use the architecture, which is kind of frustrating, I'm assuming, for the people who not only designed it, but also the developers themselves. And a lack of software support, like a real-time debugger, and special extensions for each processor were not available and needed to be developed on the spot. Even the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation 1, which was just released not far after the Jaguar, had these things from third-party developers. And I truly think if the Atari Jaguar had a larger support team to design it and also provide these tools, there's a chance it could have lasted longer. But without further ado, let's dive into this beast because, like I said before, it's a work of art and it's exciting. So let's take a look. At the heart of the hardware architecture of the Atari Jaguar, there were two main chips. One chip, known as the TOM chip, had a coprocessor package that had 3 processors internally. This handled a lot of the graphical computations. The second chip, which was the Jerry chip, had 1 processor in it that mainly handled audio processing. The TOM chip had direct access to the video DAC, whereas the Jerry chip had direct access to the audio DAC. Inside of TOM, there were 3 processors. This coprocessor unit started with the graphics processing unit, which had a 32-bit RISC architecture. It had access to all 64 bits of the system bus and could actually read 64 bits of information in one instruction. There was also 4 kilobytes of internal SRAM, which was extremely fast compared to accessing anything else in the system bus and was tremendously helpful. The second processor in the PIN package was a 64-bit RISC object processor. It had 64-bit wide registers and allowed for a lot of flexibility in terms of video processing. The final processor in this coprocessor package was another 64-bit RISC chip that dealt with blitter. This was mainly intended for 3D processing, so things like Z buffering and shading were able to be controlled by this blitter processor. Of course, there had to be a memory controller to unify all these pieces of memory together and to access DRAM directly. The Jerry chip basically consisted of 1 digital signal processor, which was a 32-bit architecture, and it was running at 26.6 MHz, quite fast, and was the same RISC core as the GPU. The Jerry chip had twice as much internal SRAM, sitting at about 8 kilobytes, due to the fact that audio tends to require more information buffering. With all the hardware on board, it was possible to do 16-bit stereo audio quality. And this software control provided a multitude of outputs in order to be made to the audio system. Not only did Jerry have hardware capabilities of being able to do multiple different output forms of audio, but it also had a clock control block timer and peripheral interrupts, and a UART, which allowed for joystick control. Jerry wasn't just a typical run-of-the-mill DSP, it was a full-blown microcontroller as well. And finally, to top all this architecture off, there was a Motorola 68000. A lot of you might recognize the 68000 from another very popular piece of hardware in the 80s, known as the Apple Macintosh. It's a general-purpose processor, and the 68000 refers to the transistor package size, so it had 68,000 transistors on it. With the unified memory architecture the Jaguar had, the DRAM was available in a 2 MB form across the 64-bit bus. Now that we know some of the pieces of hardware on this system, let's talk about the design philosophy. So for the first time in this series, I'm able to access official documents and use them for informational purposes to make this video in terms of not only design philosophy, but basically down to the register values, thanks to the Jaguar now being an open source system. The general idea was to use the 68000 in tandem with Tom and Jerry. The 68000 was intended to be a manager, something that would issue requests through the memory controller to both Tom and Jerry. Tom would handle all the graphics, while Jerry would handle most of the audio and some other miscellaneous tasks. This isn't really how in practice it was done, but it was pretty close. And in order to understand how to get the most out of it, we need to start at the base level of the basic computational piece of it. This would be the 32-bit RISC system that's implemented on it. RISC stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computer. In RISC's theory, the idea is to obtain a maximum instruction throughput of 1 instruction per clock cycle. This is a pretty amazing feat, but it does come at the cost of a few things, which we're going to get to. In order to hit that theoretical 1 instruction per clock cycle, in practice, it's possible, but you need to implement some computer architecture theory in order to get this to happen. In order to do this, there's a few options, but pipelining is the cheapest and most effective, and Tom is no different. In order for an instruction to complete, there's a series of steps that need to be completed before the value in the register is operated on appropriately and written back to that register. Generally, in von Neumann architecture, there's something called fetch, decode, and operate. In the case of the Jaguar, there's a decode, a read, the actual instruction itself, and then a write back to the register. Pipelining in computer architecture is the idea of having different stages that can be done in hardware in parallel or time-sliced variants that can execute different portions of the instruction at the same time. So this means that while you can get 1 instruction per clock cycle, you can split up in hardware the 4 different pieces in the case of the Jaguar to happen exactly at the same time. So that means that per clock cycle, 4 pieces of 1 instruction can happen at the same time. So while it may not be 1 instruction operating, it's 1 in combination with every stage of the pipeline, and eventually at the end they all meet to write back to the registers. While 1 instruction doesn't necessarily happen in 1 clock cycle continuously, 1 stage of the pipeline happens in 1 clock cycle. So if we do 4 at the same time in the case of the Jaguar, and it takes 4 sub-steps of instructions to complete 1 full instruction, then that means we have 1 instruction per clock cycle based on the pipeline. This means that we can separate the pipeline into 4 stages. 1 can handle the decode, the other the read, the third one is the actual instruction itself, and then the 4th one is the write back. So as you can see, this can become problematic, especially if there's 4 stages. That means there's 4 instructions that can be queued up at a time to be operated on. What if one of those instructions uses the same register? So with pipeline, now we get into pipeline hazards, and this is something to look out for. So typically there's 3 types of hazards. There's structural, control, and data hazards. But we're only going to talk about structural, as that's the most common that would have happened on the Atari Jaguar. A structural hazard is when 2 instructions come through the pipeline and that they require the same resource. So this would mean that they would have to be either contiguously placed or back-to-back. And in both cases, there's a chance that the registers and the instructions are similar enough to the point where they can overwrite the previous value on the second run and use the first value that was used in that register. In this case, you would get erroneous data on your second operation, and it would cause a major problem. This is what's called a hazard. Thankfully, most people who design processors understand this concept and are able to work around it. But in order to work around it, basically you're going to have to waste clock cycles waiting for the first instruction to complete to make sure that the second operation is just as good. And the technique that the Atari Jaguar designers use is something called register scoreboarding, which is not uncommon and used quite a lot. So the idea is if the processor obtains two similar instructions that use the same register, the GPU hardware is able to detect that and suspends the execution of the second instruction so that the first one has the correct value when it's ready. And this is what's known as a pipeline stall. A pipeline stall happens after a hazard manifests itself as two redundant instructions using the same resource, and in this case we would call this a structural hazard. Like I said, this is a choice by the processor designer in order so you have the correct instructions operating in order. So this can be tricky for people who haven't programmed on these systems before. They don't understand that doing certain things back to back can cause issues in the pipeline and cause pipeline stalls. This can manifest itself in a game as dropped frames, and in some rare cases, a total system crash. This is the first thing that's extremely challenging from this part, and it says specifically that the GPU was specifically designed for assembly coding and not a compiled language. So now that we understand a little bit about the design philosophy for the GPU portion of it, let's talk about some of the known hardware bugs that cause people problems outside of the tricky architecture. There's two problems stated in the documentation of the architecture. One is that the RAM used within the GPU for its registers only has two data ports. So if the instruction at the stage 3 has to write back to a different register from the two registers being read by the instruction at stage 1, a clash occurs. And this can be a major problem. The second one is the instruction at stage 1 of the pipeline may need to read a value being compared by the instruction at stage 2, but this value will not be available until the instruction reaches stage 3. So once again, a wait state would occur, and you'd be wasting probably at least 3 or 4 clock cycles. So in order to make sure that this was all in order, you had to be very careful about how you placed instructions. You also had to be extremely careful about jump instructions, so things like loops and jumping to different places in memory needed to be careful because the transfer of control doesn't occur until after the jump instruction has been executed. If anything is in the pipeline before the jump instruction, it has the potential to stop executing if it's after the jump, or before, so you have to flush the pipeline before you jump. It says the safest technique is to allow jump instructions with a null operation. In order to successfully jump correctly, you have to have a few null ops before and after. Now let's talk about some of the actual physical bugs. Remember I talked about the scoreboard technique earlier in order to prevent some type of major issue with instruction overwrite? Well, yeah, that doesn't really work on the data of any index store instruction. So this is a problem because this means that any index store instruction that stores data from a long latency operation, i.e. some type of divide or external load from flash, it can overwrite the operation that you're doing and completely destroy whatever you're doing. So it's best to put an OR instruction prior to the store, which is essentially a fake wait state. It even shows a specific example assembly code where you're supposed to put an OR operation on the register itself being placed before you store the value at the base of the stack pointer. Another issue is that any instruction where the destination register is written to without being read, the destination register can't be protected by the scoreboarding mechanism, which pretty much avoids everything that we talked about in the first place. Things like move and load variations of the instruction set aren't safe from this. One of the third major bugs is that neither the DSP or the GPU could reliably execute jump instructions unless they're an internal RAM. Remember I talked about the internal SRAM that was available in both the processors? Yeah, well, generally speaking, especially, and I'll explain why later, even outside an external RAM, the jump instructions didn't really work all that well. There's actually about 5 more things to pay attention to, but I'll spare you from it. The biggest one was that there was a bug in the division instruction of the GPU. So if you try to do 2 consecutive divides without leaving at least one wait state or one clock cycle of idle between the two, the result of the second divide will be wrong, which seems to contradict register scoreboarding's principle from before. So the workaround that they suggest is that you should wait more than 16 clock cycles between divide instructions, which is really slow, and considering the divides take a long time anyway. DSPs tend to have a lot of math tools with them, and matrix multiplication and division are no different. And the DSP had about 8K of internal SRAM, and there's a lower and an upper half. The lower 4K of Jerry only worked with matrix multiplies. Why? This was probably due to the base design of the 32-bit RISC chip. As stated before, the Tom has 4 kilobytes of internal SRAM, whereas the Jerry has 8K. But it was kind of pointless to do that if only the bottom 4 addresses, bits 2 through 11, were programmable for matrix multiplication. Why have the extra 4K of SRAM if you couldn't operate typical DSP application matrices in the other 4K? But there's 2 more major things that really caused problems for developers. One of which was a bug in the Jaguar UART. So if a start bit is detected at a certain phase, in the UART's divide 16 timer, it's shifted twice, resulting in a left shift of the data byte, so you lose the upper half of the byte. The problem can be avoided, though, by providing a dummy byte in between where the MSB is set. That is extremely annoying, especially for message processing. Ouch. The clear and move instructions of the 68000 didn't really work correctly when writing to the GPU or DSP, and this was a real problem, because in order to move things back and forth, well, you needed to use those. And their address ranges were restricted to 16 bits. And the 68000 only had a 16-bit data bus. And if you remember correctly, there's a high bandwidth, the original bus needed 32-bit writes to happen to the rest of the chips. So they actually occur as 2 16-bit writes that happen in succession. So what this really means is that from the 68000, you couldn't really access RAM, nor could you tell Tom or Jerry to access RAM accordingly based on the 16-bit instructions. You had to be very careful about how you instructed each piece of the system to work, and it was frustrating for developers. However, with certain instructions, like the move and the clear, the order of high and low are switched, so it becomes different Indian. And it causes a problem when you're outside of the ranges of address that you needed to write to. There's even a note at the bottom that says, while these are the only ones we know about at the present, it is possible that there are other instruction address mode combinations that have this problem. Thank you everybody so much for waiting me to come out with this video. I know it's taken a long time, but it took a long time to deep dive and understand this system, and it was just overwhelming the amount of information because of all the documentation I was able to actually read since it was released. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, drop a like, share a comment, let me know how I'm doing, and also give me some suggestions for what architectures I should cover. I've already gotten suggestions about easy architectures to cover, but if there's anything else you think of, please let me know. Please subscribe if you want to see the next video, because the next video will be on the Sega Saturn. Thanks everyone for the support. It's really what keeps me going with these videos. Continue to like, comment, subscribe, and share my videos, and I will crank them out quicker. Thank you so much everybody, and this is James from Zygal Studios, signing off.